Okay. As always, welcome to Generation. Next on the screen.
Yeah.
Can I move the
You're
screen?
half on, half not.
Yeah, move it this way.
Not much.
Move it over. That work?
Mm-hmm.
Or we can push it back a little bit too. Center it. Should all screens out.
There you go.
Everything's on? Okay, phones. Watch out for the step like we always do. This is going to be our, just do it this way so it's easier. This is going to be kind of a one-off lesson on Jewish history. We often don't study Jewish history that much in church. And I understand why, because we might not see that as our history. Those of us that are Gentiles might not see it as our history. But we do follow a Jewish Messiah and a Jewish rabbi. And Jesus did not come in a vacuum. He came in a point in time as developed through history. And so if we understand a bit of Jewish history, sometimes it helps us to understand what Jesus is talking about when he gives instructions. So I'm telling this in Jewish people preparing the field for Christ's harvest. Now, if I was a non-believer, I would have a very different take on Jewish history, starting from the first slide. Non-believer is not going to see the Jewish people as preparing their way for Christ's harvest. They might say for the Messiah, they did not say for Christ. They're not going to name him as such. We're going to talk about the land of Israel just briefly. I did talk about that last summer some more, but we heard about the land just briefly. We spent most of the day talking about the people and history. And then we're going to talk about the blessing. And that's all coming out of the Abrahamic covenant. The Lord says to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's house to a land I will show you, and I will make a great nation, or I'll make your seed great, some translations will say. And I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Whenever you think of the Abrahamic covenant, think of three things: land, seed, and blessing. So three words you want to think about with the Abrahamic covenant. And that's the kind of concept that we're going to be using as our template this morning. So where is Israel? None of us have ever been to Israel. Maybe you've never been there. She's been to Israel. She's here and present in mind. Yeah. But it's been a rainy morning. So if you haven't been there, you might not think about where it is. But here we are, this yellow dot. And way over here is Israel. Not quite halfway around the world, but a long ways. I think it's 6-7 time zones, something like that. It's a ways over there. This is a zoom in. Here is Israel. And we are way over. This is the sea here. We're way over here. Here's a zoom in. This is where Abraham would have started out at, down here at Ur of the Chaldeans. It may have been up in here. There's some debate about where that city is actually at, somewhere in here. And he traveled up to here. Remember the last slide says, go from your land, go from your father's house, go to land that I will tell you. First of all, him and his dad started off. They traveled up here. Not about here somewhere. It doesn't have the name of the town there. And then when Abraham received the covenant, then he traveled over here. Okay, a couple things. This is, so what continent is Israel in? Depends who you ask.
Yeah.
It's called the Middle East for a reason. It's kind of on the dividing lines of Europe, of Asia, and of Africa. And so some people say it's Asia, some people say it's part of Europe, because the plates, yes, the plate is actually about here, the Titanic plate. It kind of depends who you ask. But this location means that any traders that are traveling by camel pretty much have to go through Israel. If you're coming from Asia over New York, you kind of skirt along the top side of it, because the route kind of comes down this way. These hills here are hard to get through, so they skim across the bottom and come up this way. If you're going into Africa, you either come down the eastern route or else the western route, which is the coastal route down into Africa. Africa, you got to go through here to get to Europe or to Asia. And so the traders were constantly going through here. And if you know anything about truck drivers or sailors, is they get to a lot of places, they learn a lot of different things, and they like to talk. And so they see everything they have seen, everything they see, they tell about this to everybody else they meet. And God put them here so that they would be in the crossroads of the world. So everybody throughout the world would find out who God is. As the traders are traveling through, they see the God of Israel, Yahweh, and they tell about him everywhere they're going. Put him here. And that's also why God did not want the Canaanites there. We're dealing with that in Joshua right now. But the Canaanites were in this special place, the crossroads of the world, and they were not professing God. Instead, they were professing their gods. And it was spreading their gods throughout the world. So God removed them, put Israel there, and Israel was supposed to tell the world about their God. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But the people, the seed of Abraham. I don't necessarily think about it as seed in today's language, but that's the language they would use back then, the seed of Abraham. Early history, the conquest into Canaan. First of all, BC, you count backwards. You don't count up, you count down. So 1440 is an earlier date from 1270. You count down to 0. The conquest into Canaan to rescue the center of the world for God. So God sends them in there somewhere in this time period, 1440 to 1270. Depends who you ask. Can be a little bit outside of that, but that's most people are going to fall in that time period. God wants to rescue this area for himself, redeem this area for himself. And so they go in there and they start the Jewish nation in Israel. 1200 was approximately the time of Solomon's temple. I say temple, not the word tabernacle. This is called the first temple era period. And it lasted for, 600 years roughly, as the temple or tabernacle survived. At that point in time, it was destroyed, but we'll get to that later. In 930, roughly, again, these dates are a little bit iffy, but roughly, the kingdom is divided. So David's son Solomon had a son. His son Solomon was not a great ruler towards the tail end, and people did not like him so well. And when it came time for his son to take over Rehoboam, the people came to Rehoboam and said, "Hey, have some mercy on us. Your dad made life rough for us. Can you make it a little easier for us?" Rehoboam, after consulting with his wise men, said, "Nope, I'm going to make it tougher on you." And so 10 tribes out of the 12 left Rehoboam, rebelled against him, said, "We're not going to have you as our king anymore." There's a war, but we're not getting that very, very much. The kingdom was divided. So David's line covers the southern part of the kingdom, down in here, and the 10 tribes are all to the north. Actually, David's down here, and 10 tribes are up in this area here. Here's the Dead Sea, here's the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River comes right down through here. And it's split up that way. And also some of the 10 tribes, are on the west or the east side, East Bank. God still has his people in this land. They are divided. The northern kingdom very quickly falls away from God and really doesn't turn back to God again. There are times when they kind of come back to God a little bit, but for the most part, very quickly, they become Canaanite themselves. They become pagan, become Canaanite themselves, and God no longer has a witness in that area. What that does is when the 12 northern tribes leave, any of the traders coming up this way no longer run into the God of Israel. They run into Canaanite gods. They have to go down through down to Africa. And so Europe really, for the most part, does not hear about Yahweh again for many years. Most of the traders going out of Asia and into this way or into this way, and if this is no longer up here, no longer Yahweh followers, they're not hearing about it. Okay, we gotta keep going because I got a bunch of slides. So people will become Canaanite. This is, except First Kings is much later, and this is the point in time when pretty much most of Israel has wandered away from God. Ahab was northern king. He did more evil in the eyes of God than any of those before him. He's considered the worst king until the next one, kind of. No, he was about the worst king. God sends Elijah to be a witness to his own people. He no longer has his people as a witness. He has to send a prophet to his own people. The people have rebelled against God, and they have joined force with God's enemies. They have become Canaanite themselves, and that's a big problem. Okay, middle history. The Syrians. Should put a map in here. The Syrians are to the north, and they invade down into Egypt, and they conquer the northern kingdom at this point. The Syrians were brutal. They killed and maimed, and they were brutal people. And they conquered the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom really got hurt badly by this. Eventually, the Babylonians conquered the Syrians, and eventually the Babylonians came down and conquered the southern kingdom. So between 720 and we're going to say 580, give or take a few years, all of the Israelites are conquered. And there's more wars that happen in there, but they are displaced, they're taken away. And there were some people that stayed, and some people at that point in time fled down to Egypt. So there's a dispersion that's starting to happen already. But for the most part, the Israelites are gone. There are other nationalities that are brought in to occupy the land. Later on, you run into the Samaritans, where people are brought into the land. And then roughly around 539 BC, the Persians, who had conquered Babylon, issued a decree sending these people back. And it was not just the Israelites that got sent back, it was many different people that got sent back. So, regroup. Syrians were the first, Babylonians conquered the Syrians, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and eventually the Persian king Cyrus the Great issued an edict allowing the Jews to return to the land of Israel. Only about 10 to 20% of the Jews that were in Persia returned. Most of the Jews, and that was only the ones that were in Persia, most of the Jews, probably 95, 98% of the Jews, never returned to Israel. They are spread throughout the world. The lessons the returning Jews learned in captivity. Number one, do not become Canaanite. Become Canaanite, we're going to lose our land again. Stay faithful to the Torah is another thing they learned. And then the last one was, be ye holy, for I am holy, is a quote from Jeremiah. Separate yourself from evil. And so they put strong barriers between them and the outside world. What they should have learned was what God originally wanted to learn. In you all the nations will be blessed. Be a blessing. Tell others about me. Bring the stranger and foreigner into the Father's house of the Be'av. Adopt them in like Rahab and like the Gibeonites. Bring them into your house and teach them about God. Don't let them teach you about their gods. You teach them about your God. Be proactive. And then keep yourself pure, and promote Yahweh to your neighbors. When it says be ye holy, it does not mean separate yourselves, but be ye holy inside, is what they were supposed to learn. But they did not. They learned the first lessons, and we will see the ramifications of the first lessons pulling down into Jesus' period. God's people failed to make a place where people could come and learn about God. And so, God dispersed them throughout the world to demonstrate this God to every nation. That's kind of a powerful thought. They didn't do what they're supposed to do, so God said, fine, if you're not in my land doing what I want you to do, then go everywhere, and everybody will learn about me accidentally just by seeing you. In a place where you're a stranger and pilgrim, someplace you don't belong, they will learn about your God there. Diaspora is a Latin word, a Greek word, that means dispersion. Most Jews would talk more about an exile. They would use, I forget what the term is, but they would use more the idea of an exile. This is the diaspora of up to about the time of Jesus, a little bit after that. This is all the areas, some of the areas that the Israelites, the Jewish people, had spread out to. They're down into Africa. In fact, they're even down into Ethiopia, which is down here. They're much farther east from here as well, but this is the main settlements. You see, they're even up in here in Britain. That's a long ways from Israel, and it's on an island. So they went a long ways. They were spread out, some by force, some by wandering, some by trading, but they spread out and they formed these little colonies all over the Mediterranean world. That diaspora is still happening today, though in some ways it's starting to reverse now and come back. And we'll get into that later. this is one illustration of the diaspora. This is a place down in Ethiopia and then down into South Africa. And I'll have the map. Well, actually, I think, no, I thought I put maps in here. Maybe I didn't. This is a very interesting group. It's the Ethiopian Jews. As you can see, they are black. Jewish people are darker than us, but they're not dark. They're fairly white. They're more like Arab coloring. Even the nose shape is very similar to a Jewish nose shape. So there's some genetics that show through, but not totally. In recent years, they've done a fair amount of DNA testing on the Beta Israel, and they found that there is definitely some markers from as Israelite markers in the DNA. But there's also some other markers as well from other groups. Who are they? Where do they come from? Well, the other night, Wednesday night, we talked about it might be the Gibeonites. We read about in Joshua about the Gibeonites. Quite possibly that has some of the DNA. Maybe earlier diaspora. The Queen of Sheba probably came from this area, and she came up to Solomon. Possibly some Jewish people went back with her. Don't really know, but somehow the Jewish faith got down there, as well as their genetics. So they actually traveled down there. Most of these have migrated back to Israel because of some rough living conditions in South Africa and in Ethiopia. The Muslims have taken over, made it rough for these people. And so they've come back to Israel. Here is 3 different Mossad operations, Jewish Mossad. Operation Moses was the first one, and then Joshua and Solomon. And if you want to watch any thrillers, there's some pretty good YouTube videos on those 3 operations. But yeah, it's really interesting what they did. I think it was Operation Moses. I think it was Moses, or it was Joshua. I think it was Moses, where they took over an old, not retreat. What's the word you have? People that come and visit it. Can't think of the term I'm looking for. But they took this thing over and built it up and made it really colorful and sent advertisements all over the world to come here and visit this place. But it was really an undercover operation. In daytime, the staff there were actually Mossad agents, and they would take care of these wealthy guests that were coming in. At nighttime, they would hop in their buggies and go out and rescue these people that were in staging spots out in the desert, bring them back, put them in boats, and ship them out of there. It's kind of interesting. Eventually, the local authorities picked up on what's going on, and they moved in to raid it. And the Mossad agents that got tipped off, they all disappeared. And when they raided it, all that was left was about a few hundred guests, wealthy guests from all over the world that were in this place. And there was a lot of questions being asked, and they all realized they didn't know anything about it. And it took a while for some of them to get out because passports were gone. They had anything. And so, yeah, it was interesting. That's some interesting stories there. The Sephardic Jews, they went to Spain and Portugal. So they moved all across the top of the Mediterranean and went out that way. They arrived probably by the 1st century AD, so around the time of Christ. Not sure exactly when they came, but somewhere around the time of Christ. And they lived there in mass until the 1492. Does that date ring a bell with you at all? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah. Somewhere around there is when they were expelled. Some of them still stayed there, and there's some there that are still there today. But for the most part, they have left. They are mostly up now, either in Israel, maybe got back to Israel by now, but some are up in the Baltic states in the north there. Many of them converted to Christianity. And one of the things that was offered them is you can either leave or convert. But most of them, many of them converted to Christianity actually very early on. When the gospel got there through Paul and some others, you had these Hellenistic Jews, we'll get that term in a little bit, that were living in these places, and they heard about this Messiah, and many of them converted right away. And that was some of the reason why Spain was such an early place of Christianity, was the Sephardic Jews. The Chinese Jews, there's Jews living in China. There are. They arrived somewhere around 700 to 950. Overland routes, probably, traders. Most likely, they arrived there as traders, and then they set a base up there, kind of trading post where they can get the goods. And so when other traders come in, they don't have to find the goods, take back, they have them ready to ship back. But they stayed. It was mostly men that went there. They married Chinese women, and thus you can see they look like Chinese. Very similar. Again, the nose is not quite, it's more of a Jewish nose than a Chinese nose. It's one of the markers, genetic markers of most Israelites. But they are mostly Chinese Jewish half-breeds now, crossbreeds. The DNA, there's some markers, and I read some stuff on this, but I don't quite understand DNA testing. But there is markers that show that the male line is mostly Jewish, while the female line is mostly Chinese. That's kind of interesting. Judaism passes down your Jewish heritage through the female lines, how they consider if you're Jewish or not. So Matt is Jewish. His children are not considered Jewish because it goes through the female line. They pass it down to the male line. And so most Judaism does not consider these people as Jewish, but they consider themselves Jewish. And you can see this is something they held on to, like the yarmulke right here. They held on to a lot of the Jewish customs and even the Jewish texts for the last over 1,000 years. And for most of that time period, they were isolated from the rest of Judaism. They were the only monotheistic people serving one God in China. And it was interesting, at one point in time, they were there and they ran into a Jesuit monk king. Or they heard about this Jesuit monk king, and they heard about this monotheist that was preaching. And so they traveled to meet him. And when they got there, they realized that he is not a Jew. He's a Christian or something else. They didn't know who he was, but he's not a Jew. And so I guess he's just another monotheist of some sort. He goes back, finds some Jewish people, and they actually came and met up with these people back in probably 15, 16, 1700, somewhere around there. Again, dates are a little bit hard to come by. Today, there's about 2,500 of these Kuftan people left, and the government has kind of cracked down on them in recent years. They were trying to be approved as an official state religion because if it's a historic Chinese religion, then they get some protections. However, the Chinese government did not give them that, and this was back in the early 2000s. 2014, they started cracking down on them, and they had a pretty rough, about as hard as Christians do in China right now. The Chinese government is not friendly towards them. Okay, second temple period. So we're going to move back in history now. We're just up in modern time. Move back into history. Second temple period is, okay, so when they got taken into exile, they came back, they rebuilt the temple. That's the second temple period. Second temple period goes from the time of the exile through Jesus Christ, through the time of Christ. 70 AD is when it destroyed. So 516 is when it was built. 70 AD is when it was destroyed. So roughly 585 years that temple existed. You have a time, another date stamp that's important is Malachi in your Bibles is the last of the prophets. And he is roughly 430 BC. Give or take 50 years, but roughly 430 BC. And so there's no more word from God for 400 years. From the time of Malachi up until the time of the angel coming to Mary and to Elizabeth, or not Elizabeth, to John. There's 4 years that God is not sending any prophets, he's not sending angels, there's no message from God. Another thing that happened during time is Alexander the Great. I should have put a date in front of my name. Alexander the Great is, 280, 300 BC? Somewhere in there, give or take a little bit, I forget. And he takes conquest over the whole Mediterranean area into Africa, or down in Africa, into Asia. He covers that whole area and takes over. Eventually, his soldiers kind of rebel against him or revolt against him and said, we don't want to go anymore, we're done fighting, we want to go home. And so they did go home. On the way home, it seems like his dreams of ruling the whole world were shattered. He turns to drinking, and he probably dies of liver poisoning. That's what history seems to say. But he had conquered the whole area, including Israel. In 160 to 167 is a Maccabean revolt. There was, I think that was silent. We'll get back to the Maccabean revolt very, very soon. Yeah, Alexander the Great. So 356 to 323 is when he lived, and towards this, so probably about, I'm going to say 323 to 335 or so is when most of his conquests happened. He advances Greek life and culture. At that point in time, the Greek life and culture probably was the highest culture available. Their ability of engineering, their ability of complex thought, their ability of writing, so many areas they were at a much higher level than most of the other cultures. and he advances his Greek thought throughout his conquest. Many of the Jews began to adopt this Greek, it's called Hellenistic thought, ways of thinking and working. And you have Jews who are religious on the Sabbath, but the rest of the week they're thinking like Greeks. During this time period, the Greek Septuagint is translated from the written Torah. The Torah, the first 5 books, and it is translated into the Greek text. How it happened was the king in Africa, in Alexandria of Egypt, wanted to gather all the knowledge from the whole world into one library, sent messages out throughout the world saying, send me all your writings, we want to gather it all here. They brought in the Hebrew New Testament, nobody could read Hebrew, so he sent for some rabbis to translate it. He had no problem finding rabbis who knew Greek, they were all Hellenistic by this point anyway, and they traveled down there, and they were supposed to all translate a separate copy of the Torah into Greek. And the story goes that they were put in 17 different rooms, and they all brought their 7 different translations back, and they all matched exactly. The idea was that you're going to bring them all back and we'll argue about the differences and figure it out. But they all matched exactly, and the story goes that it was a miracle from God that they all matched exactly. Like one rabbi said, he says, you call that a miracle? That's not a miracle. Put 70 rabbis in one room and see if they come up with the same translation, and that's a miracle, because they tend to want to argue about all the little things. So yes, this is a Greek New Testament, but this would be a little bit like the writing would look like. You can pass that back through. But they would translate it. There's different Bibles out there. My English Bible. I even have a Santa Bible.
Wow.
See that? Santa Bible? You know what that is. It's Spanish, Santa, it's holy. So yes, a lot of different languages. That's Greek. You're not going to be able to read that most likely. Dawson might be able to read a little bit of it, but probably struggle to understand it anyway. So the Greek Septuagint was written from the Torah. And very quickly, the Septuagint becomes the Bible for all this Greek-speaking, Greek-thinking Jewish audience. And this is only the Old Testament at this point. That's the New Testament. We're talking about the Old Testament. Okay, the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabees were concerned about the influence of Greek. They were concerned about the Greek thinking, the Greek forms taken in their temple, and so they were concerned about this. And then Archelaus defiled the temple. Different accounts. Some accounts say he offered a pig on the altar. Some accounts say he offered a sacrifice to his own gods. But in some way, he defiled the temple. And his official ordered Matthias, who was a kind of country priest, to offer a sacrifice to an idol. Matthias refused. He ended up killing the official. And then Matthias' son Judah led a guerrilla force and defeated Archelaus in about a 7-year period. And it's back and forth a little bit. I'm just giving you I could go through, take 45 minutes to go through the whole thing, but defeated them. And the descendants of Matthias, who became the Hamosean dynasty, continued as the rulers or the kings of Judaism for the next 150 years or so. Maybe not quite that long. They were also, at one point in time, they became oppressive to people. And they really oppressed people. At one point in time, they claimed the position as high priest as well as king, which was a big problem because while they claimed to be of Judah's line, Judah in the Old Testament, so they had the right of king, they had their claim to the priesthood was really shaky. And so that became a problem down the road. Here's a man, he's a modern Jewish scholar and historian. I've appreciated his stuff over the last year or so that I found him. He has over 900 videos on YouTube. Most of the lectures, he's a college professor, most of the lectures on Judaism. So if you want to study Judaism, that's a good place to go. He has taught at the university level for the last 35 years. In fact, one of his first places was up here at FAU. One of his first places that he was teaching as an adjunct faculty member. And now he is teaching in New York at, I forget what, the college there. It's a Jewish college. He's not a Christian. So he's going to take a different viewpoint than I would on some things in history. But I think he's mostly fair to history. So if you want to watch some stuff, that's a good one. here are the original works that we have on Judaism. Most of them. There's a few other smaller works. The first one over there is Josephus. I have a book of Josephus here. Josephus had a couple different books that he published. This one has them all inside, and as you can see, it is quite a bit of stuff. Josephus is a Hellenistic Jew, and so when he writes about Greek, he thinks it's great. In fact, at one point in time, he's a traitor, and he helps the Greeks conquer at least Jerusalem, probably a couple other cities too. The other one is Phileo. We don't really know how to pronounce that because it's argued about. We call it Phileo. His writings are probably roughly about the same as this, maybe a little bit more. And he's also Hellenistic. There's even some questions. He does a lot of writing on Hebrew and on the scriptures, but he is not very good at Hebrew. We know that. We don't even know if he even knew Hebrew. He probably was actually relying on rabbis around him to give him some terms in Hebrew. He's Greek speaking. He writes in Greek thought. It's not Hebrew. Last one, the book of the Maccabees. This is Jewish. It's not Hellenistic Jew, it's the other wing. And they also give the history of this time period. So these are the three different books that kind of give the history of this 400 years and a little bit after time period of Israel history. Okay, let's go into Torah. You have the regular Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses. Sometimes they would include some other books, but first 5 books of Moses. You could say the Old Testament. Sometimes the Torah is used a little bit expanded, saying all the Old Testament. But then you have the Midrash, which is the rabbi or the teachers. It's called the teachings. The teachings or discussion on the written Torah. And it's interesting. If you read it, you'll find lots of contradictions in there because it is rabbis, teachers arguing about what these texts mean, how they should apply them. And so one will say, you should do it this way. And right beside that will be those saying, no, you should do it this way. So which one's right? The idea is you're supposed to wrestle with the text. And you're supposed to find a way to apply this text. The Mishnah was much later. I have down here 200 AD. That's the best dates I could find on it, but I actually think it's probably earlier. The Mishnah was developed. It was put into a written form in 200 AD. But probably it came down as an oral tradition from many years earlier, possibly 500 years earlier. And this was more of, I'm going to say, a prayer or a songbook, maybe along the lines of our Proverbs or Psalms. This never was in their Torah, but it was the oral Torah. And as we get later on, we'll realize that we'll see that some people actually saw this as almost scripture, while others rejected it. Yes. The Talmud is another name. This was compiled in 200 AD when the Mishnah was written down. They wrote it all down, the Midrash and the Mishnah, and it's 2 different copies of the Talmud. So we don't know what the exact early one was. It's possible that they wrote it down 2 different places, but it's probably more likely that an early copy went to Babylon or went to Jerusalem, probably to Babylon, and then got altered. The Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud do not agree. The texts do not agree. They're not the same. But they do talk about the same topics. And some places they do agree, some places they don't agree. So the Talmud is sometimes referred to as the Mishnah and Midrash kind of compiled together. That was something that was interesting because the rabbi who did it, he wanted to put this all written down. Before then, it was all oral. It was just passed down from one to the next. And he wanted to write it down, and it created kind of controversy. Do you codify the oral Torah in the same way you do the written Torah? Do you make the oral Torah, written Torah? At that place, people were concerned that it was going to become like the Old Testament. And so it was very controversial. They did it, and some people accepted, some people didn't. Okay, political parties at the time of Jesus. Sadducees, I'm going to call them the traditionalists. They were the high priest line coming down through. They were aristocrats. They were a very select group. They had very distinct clothing. They were very wealthy. They were often Hellenistic, which would be, it's interesting. You would think that the high priest, the priest line, would not be Hellenistic, but no, they were. They were their wealth and their aristocrat ways had made them very susceptible to Greek teachings, and they became Hellenistic almost exclusively. They only accepted the written Torah. They did not accept the oral Torah. They considered it worse than dirt. Fire was too good for the documents in their minds, so they did not accept that at all. They denied the resurrection of the dead. The reason is the written Torah does not really talk about the resurrection, though Jesus says, "Oh yes, it does," and he gives them a proof text. It does not really talk about the resurrection of the dead, while the oral Torah talked about it a lot. So they rejected the resurrection of the dead. Jesus goes into debates with them on that. They believed the Greeks and the Romans were beneficial to Judaism because they protected them, is the way they saw it. So we have our Greek ways, Greek life, and our spiritual Judaism. And they can work quite well. And they saw that the Greeks and later on the Romans were beneficial, worked with them closely. Pharisees were the fundamentalists. Fundamentalists, instead of the traditionalist says, we're just going to keep things going the way they're going. If it's good enough for our fathers, good enough for us. Fundamentalists say, we need to get back to the source. And we figure out what the best source is, the roots. We anchor in there. And anybody who does not agree with this source, we need to get rid of. Anyway, we can. It's kind of fundamentalism. Pharisees were fundamentalists. They believed the study of Torah was the highest form of worship. Getting back to our roots, not just our traditional roots, but our foundation, the Torah. So we're going to study it. They accepted the written Torah as well as the verbal Torah. And they did not elevate the verbal Torah at the same level as the written Torah, but they did elevate it pretty highly. They really held no power. For the most part, they held no power, but they did hold a great bit of influence. The Sadducees, while they had the power, they were not giving anything to the people that the people could appreciate. They were not really teaching well. They were aloof from the people. The Pharisees were more than happy to get down and dirty and teach people on a one-on-one basis or in small gatherings in the synagogues. So they held a lot of influence. It was called soft power. They had a lot of soft power. And even up to the modern era, Judaism is largely influenced by Pharisaical thoughts and practices. If you walk into a synagogue today, the way they did it today would be very similar to the way the Pharisees would have done it in Jesus' time. And I'll go even a step farther. I will say Christianity, the way we practice our faith, is also very much structured after the Pharisees. So let's not look down on the Pharisees too hard. They had some problems, especially as time went on, but we have followed their model for the most part, as far as teaching, as far as instruction. Even our school systems are very closely structured after Pharisaical thought. Pharisaical can be a bad term, means somebody who is saying one thing and doing another thing, but it's also be referred to as just somebody of Pharisee origin. And I'm using it in the better term here. They believed that the Greek and Roman rule was tolerable for Judaism. It was not necessarily a good thing, but we could get along with it. It's not worth stirring the pot, is how the Pharisees were seeing it. The Zealots, they were a progressive group. They said, if we can dream of a better tomorrow, then we can make it. And we're going to do everything we can to make this happen. And I'm using progressive kind of as in the broad sense, not as a small, narrow way as we use it many times a day. They were radical. They were willing to give their lives for this ideal. They formed a guerrilla fighting force, and they made no difference in killing Hellenistic Jews, especially the Sadducees. They really hated them, and the invading armies. They didn't care if they were killing a high priest or if they were killing a Roman soldier. They saw that both of these are invaders and are taking their faith away from them. A couple people, Barabbas, read about that during Jesus' death. He was probably a zealot. He said he was involved in an insurrection and murder. It doesn't say he's a zealot, but that's what the zealots did. And so if you think about it, the Sadducees and the Pharisees aren't really friends with the zealots because the zealots are killing them. And they chose to get Barabbas out rather than Jesus. So when we think about aren't they on the same side? Of course they want Barabbas. No, they don't really want Barabbas. Simon. Two of Jesus. No, he was one of Jesus' disciples. Oh, yeah. These two people Simon, Jesus' disciple, was also a zealot. It says Simon the zealot. Jesus took one of them as his disciples. It was probably a little interesting. You have Matthew, the tax collector, somebody who's working for Rome. You could liken him somewhat to a Pharisee. You could, or a Sadducees. You could say Nathaniel, probably, or Bartholomew, as he was referred to, is probably a Pharisee. And then you have the zealot, and they're all Jesus' disciples. I imagine they made some interesting conversations. The zealots believe they can only truly worship when the temple and the priesthood was restored. The invaders were pushed out, and the monarchy, David's monarchy, was back in control. And so they were trying to expel the Romans, expel the Greeks, and then expel the Romans, expel everyone who had sympathies to them, so they put their own kingdom back in place and would return it to David's line. They were trying to do it. Then you have the next group, the Essenes. They were, I'm going to call them mystics. In some ways, they were not necessarily looking for truth because, yeah, they wanted truth, but truth would kind of like destroy the mystery. And they saw God in a mysterious way. Modern day Jewish people, for the most part, think very lowly of the Essenes. They were a celibate group. They did not have married, did not have children, so they have to go into the surrounding areas to recruit more members to join them. They lived in the wilderness of Qumran. I should have a map up here right now. Down towards the Salt Sea, or Dead Sea, up in the hills there. They spent their time in prayer and study. And they recorded much of the Jewish writings today we know as Dead Sea Scrolls. We didn't know a lot about these Essenes until we found their caves in 1954, I think it was, when they stumbled across. They knew they were there before then. They found a few of them, but that's when they started really finding them. And as I heard one rabbi said, then we realized how weird these people really were once they found their caves and their writings. They would have said that the whole of society is pagan. And the only way to worship God is you remove yourself from it. You're not going to, they said to the zealots, you're not going to take it up by Hillel. No, it's pagan. You're not going to take it over. But we need to separate ourselves from it. Kind of like the monks at a much later time. Separate themselves from it. And in this remote place, now they can worship God. They can find their quiet. They can find their tranquility. And they worship God in this remote place. Okay, so how does this all fit together? You have the zealots. They're progressive. They're active. They're idealistic. And they're trying to pull the Jewish nation that direction. Pharisees are, in some ways, direct opposites of them. They're fundamentalists, and they're active and they're pragmatic. They're not running away like the Essenes are going to. They're active. They're trying to pull the nation of Israel this direction, but they are looking back at the documents. Now, the Zealots and the Pharisees, in some ways, they were very close. In some ways, they were very far apart. The Zealots would have thought of Scripture very much the way the Pharisees thought of Scripture, but they did not think of life in the Jewish nation the same way. And so it did bring them head-to-head many times. The Essenes, they were the mystics. They were passive. We're just going to get away from it all. We're not going to try to fix things. We're just going to get away from that. And they're idealistic. So you've got both the Zealots and the Essenes are idealistic. The one is active. The one is passive. And it kind of plays into who they are as progressive mystics. Then you have the Sadducees. They're traditional, they're passive, and they're pragmatic. So you see the passive and pragmatics, those on the sides are pragmatic, passive, active. Over here you have the idealistic, and you have the active and the passive. And they're all trying to pull Israel their direction. There's four ruling parties or four parties of thought, and they're all trying to pull Israel, trying to pull the worship of God their direction. They're saying, this is how you worship God. And we're going to pull and fight and do anything we have to do. Sometimes the Pharisees would work with the Sadducees in order to defeat the Zealots. Sometimes the Zealots work with the Pharisees in order to defeat the Sadducees. They'll work with the others if we have to in order to gain on our end. They're always working this triangulation, trying to pull the worship of God to their way. They're forgetting what worship of God is like. God is one. Love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. They're forgetting the Shema, though they quote it day after day after day after day. They're forgetting to live their life by the Shema. Instead, they're trying to pull Israel in the worship of God their direction. The rabbis. During Jesus' time, just before Jesus' time, you had a lot of the rabbis. Most of them were Pharisees. Almost all were Pharisees. This is their education. What time is it? Got a little bit of time. I might have a short discussion time today. This is education on all Jewish people, and I actually have this. You can pass this around. You can read it later, but there is a copy of that. As early as age 3. How old is Benjamin? He's 3? 3 and a half? As early as age 3, they would begin memorizing the book of Leviticus at home. You read Leviticus lately? It's not the easiest book to memorize. And usually by the time they were 5, they would have Leviticus memorized as well often the rest of the books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Is a good chance by the time they were 5, they would have those memorized. If they didn't have memorized, they would learn it in Beth Shefer. That was their local elementary school. And they're learning to read. They're learning the law. Because if you learn to read, you learn the law, you can learn what you need for life. And so they are memorizing this. By age 10, they had memorized the books. Most had memorized the books of law. Probably some slow students might not, but they would have memorized by that time. Most of the girls, and all the girls, most of the boys, would leave school and start a trade to support them through life. The girls would go home, learn how to keep house. The boys would go work as a tanner, or as a potter, or whatever else was available to them. And the boys did not pick what they wanted to do. Dad picked that for them, or Mom picked that for them. They would see what they thought they were skilled at, what opportunities they had, who would take them on to learn the trade, and they would go to work. Age 10. A few, the brightest and the most passionate, would stay behind and would begin Mishnah, or the study of the prophets. And that study of prophets simply means, for the most part, you're memorizing. You continue to memorize. Age 12, the boys that were left, most of them, would drop out by age 12. They would join the men in the study of the prophets. So the ones who dropped out, ones who aren't actively in school anymore, every evening they are studying Beth Midrash at evening school, while also learning a trade. They're studying the law, the prophets, but also the oral Torah. Spend a lot of time with the oral Torah at Beth Midrash. In fact, possibly it was all oral Torah, but mostly that anyway. Age 15, the best students, maybe 1 out of 300, that's what it's often thought of. 1 out of 300 students that was started would still be in school, and they would begin studying the Talmud or the Rabbinic interpretations. Now they're not just getting a little bit of a song, learning one night at Beth Midrash, evening school. Now they're actually studying, memorizing, and wrestling with the text. From there, a few would continue on. They would find a rabbi, and they would ask the rabbi if they could follow him. The rabbi would also say, "Yeah, come with me for a couple weeks. If you like it, you can. If it seems like it's working, you can stay with me. Otherwise, go find a trade." The rabbi never approached the students. This is something different from Jesus. Jesus was a rabbi as well, and he did when I called his students. And that paper kind of goes into that a little bit, I think. I remember it. But it's very different from the way the rabbis would have worked. There's even a Jewish legend, that Jesus was a Talmudim, or disciple of a rabbi, and they had a falling out. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it. They had a falling out, and Jesus went off this way then, in kind of a rebel way after he had his falling out. That's how the Jews will tend to excuse Jesus as Messiah. But this idea of rabbi is something that's very much part of the Jewish system in Jesus' time. And it's helpful for us to know about that. Okay, the Messiah. Remember, the last part is the blessing. The Messiah is going to come. You're going to be a blessing. You are going to be blessed, and you're going to be a blessing to the whole world. People prepared for the Messiah. At the time of Christ, the Jews were following the letter of the law closer than any time in history. And this is coming from a number of different sources, some Jewish, some non-Jewish. But the idea that they are following the law, 5 books of Moses, as closely as they can, is there. One of the things that they're doing that was not done for the most part was the Feast of the Tabernacles. It was only observed maybe twice in the Old Testament. Even during David's time, they were not observing the Feast of the Tabernacles. But during this time, they are. They're following the law to the letter. Not necessarily the spirit of the law. Some of that's lacking a little bit, but they're following the letter of the law. The diaspora has scattered Yahweh's followers throughout the world And these were prepared people for the gospel. They had the idea of monotheism. They had the idea of they had Old Testament, and they were just ready, looking, waiting for a Messiah. And so when the word that Jesus is the Christ and Messiah got to them, many of them fell in line right away and jumped on it. Many of these Hellenistic Jews were not really welcomed back into Israel. Some of them have forgotten Hebrew. They were not really welcomed back into Jerusalem, welcomed to the feast. And so when they had a Messiah, it was an easy way for them to find God. And they jumped on board. And that is some of the reason why Christianity spread so quickly. The concept of rabbi and discipleship was a great construct for Jesus to work under. And this was something that was not there during the time of the Old Testament, but it was there by the time of Jesus was there. And I think God intended it. God developed it. But that gave Jesus a great framework to work under, and for everybody to understand who he was. Nothing that was happening at this time of Jesus was religious passion was very, very high. There was about a half a dozen competing messiahs during Jesus' time. They would say, "Oh, I'm the Messiah, follow me," and they would follow him, and eventually they'd be killed. And this, you even see this at one point. The high priest is talking about this, about Jesus. He said, if this is of God, you're not going to fight against it. And if it is not of God, then, and if it is of God, you're not going to fight against it. If it's not of God, it's going to fade like all the rest fade. It's just another fake Messiah. Well, religious passion was high. They looked for the Messiah. They thought it was going to come very, very soon. Lessons for today. Number one, learn a lesson God wants us to learn. Sometimes we see something, and we learn a lesson, but it's the wrong lesson. And remember, Jewish people learned a lesson, primarily keep yourself separate from the world, do not interact with these pagans, and so they would not tell anybody about the Messiah, tell anybody about their faith. That wasn't the lesson God wanted them to learn. And we ought to learn the lessons God wants to learn through life events. Keep our focus on what God wants us to be and do, rather than using the triangulation to achieve what we idolize. Remember that thing with different arrows? These people were all using, the Zealots, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, were all using this triangulation of getting other people on their side so they can hold them this way, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that idea. I don't think that's the best way to go through life. The best way to go through life is to find something that's worth giving your life for. Shema is a good option. And focus on that rather than focus on how can I pull everybody my way. Well, another lesson is God's will be done. Either with a willing heart or through much pain and suffering. Our choice. His will is going to be done, but it may be through a lot of hard times. God wanted his people to be in Israel as a light for him there. Instead, they rebelled, they become Canaanite. So now God has spread that light throughout the whole world. So a lot of pain and suffering. God is sovereign. And while we have free will, many times our free will is, will his will be done through much pain or least pain. We have free will, but God's will be done. He is sovereign. That's some lessons we can learn from Jewish history. Okay,